guys do your thing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Isaac Dovere. I'm the Chief Washington Correspondent for Politico, which means that I pay attention to polls maybe more than I should, or not as much as I should. We have two really good people here to walk us through this, and we're going to do it like a debate format, which is why they have their podiums, which means that we're going to get a 3-minute intro from each of them. Then I'm going to try to ask a couple of questions that get us going. And 6 minutes, I'm sorry, 6 minutes. 6 minutes from each, and then we'll have what to go. We have a clock up here to keep us on time. And then why don't we just start off with, let's try to do show of hands to get it going. The question is, we have do polls do more harm than good? And Charlie is going to be supporting that in our debate format here. Bradley is going to be opposing that. That does not mean that that captures all the nuances that they have about this question, but they'll get into that, I'm sure. So just to start off, show of hands, if the question is, do polls do more harm than good, how many people say yes? All right. And no? All right, it looks like sort of even right now, so it's up to you guys to change that. Bradley, you were introduced first, but Charlie is supporting the proposition, so we'll have him go first.
Great.
Go for it.
Great. Some of you may have seen a few days ago in the New York Times Bret Stephens' inaugural column, and he talked about how we live in a world which data conveys authority. But authority has a way of descending to certitude, and certitude begets hubris. And we should know this by now, but instead we tend to respond to the inherent uncertainties of data without revising our assumptions, but instead just creating an impression of certainty that can be lulling, misleading, and even dangerous. And talk to Hillary Clinton if you don't agree with that. Obviously, Hillary was the highest profile recent polling fail, and almost only 4 out of 61 aggregated polls from October through Election Day showed Donald Trump winning the election. So that's sort of our starting point. And Bradley probably has lots of caveats about the margin of error, and some smart analysts will point out that national polls are not the same thing as the Electoral College, and that's all true, but the flip side of that is the media focuses on the headlines and the national head-to-head tracking poll, and that creates a totally false impression, and it's false. It creates problems on both ends. There's 2 key points. 1, polls are inaccurate. And 2, even if they were accurate, they're harmful to democracy and they're just plain bad. The first point is that public polling isn't accurate. In the many polls that got 2012 presidential election wrong, almost all of them got the 2016 elections wrong. And the issue is that polls aren't changing with the times. Dan Wagner, the chief analytics officer of the 2012 Obama campaign, explained that it's crazy that people are using the same tools for polling that were used in the 1930s. And there are 2 trends that are driving the unreliability of polling. One is the growth of internet and cell phones, and second is the decline of people that are willing to answer surveys. So first of all, we talked about the growth of cell phones and the growth of internet polling. With public polling's demise started when people started using unlisted telephone numbers, and then with the advent of caller ID, and then with finally cell phones, and the fact that they're too expensive for pollsters to call, and so they don't know how to get the right mix of cell phones and landline phones. About 40% of Americans have landlines now, but it's much more expensive for pollsters to call cell phones because they can't do random digit dialing due to FCC rules. And that's a problem because 47% of US adults only have cell phones. Also, with the rise of internet polling, there's huge problems there in terms of coverage error. Not everyone is reachable online, and Pew estimates that 87% of American adults are internet users, but this skews towards younger liberal people, and then the landlines skew towards older voters on the other side, and it's very hard to correct for both of those things. So I said that there were two things. One is the growth of cell phones and internet, that's making polling inaccurate. The second thing is the decline in people willing to answer surveys. It used to be that in the 1930s, when they first started doing surveys, 90% of people that that were asked a survey would complete the full survey because they thought it was their civic duty to do so. Now people don't trust pollsters and don't want to spend the time taking the survey, so they have extremely low response rates. And when people do respond to them, there's things like what used to be called the Bradley effect, and that was when white voters would say they were voting for the African American candidate because they thought that was the socially acceptable thing they were supposed to do. So the African American support would be oversampled. Now, this year, we saw something called the Trump effect, and that was where people wouldn't admit they were voting for Donald Trump. So it undersampled support for Trump in the polls, and that's where when you had electronic polls without a human being talking, you got much higher responses of people saying they were supporting Trump, but they were embarrassed to admit that to another person. So that it led to skewing in the polling also.
Charlie,
so these are the reasons. Okay, these are the reasons that polling is inaccurate. But even if Bradley tells you that polling is really accurate and it's great and it's exactly spot on, I would argue that the way that the media and campaigns use head-to-head polling skews turnout, and that's a bad effect. It can lead to, in Hillary Clinton's case, her supporters thought their vote didn't matter, and so she lost the election because urban voters stayed home because they thought they didn't need to vote. But on the other hand, for Republicans in states like Florida, when they announced that the Republican is behind or losing, then people in the Panhandle who are behind, which is an hour behind in the voting, they sit home and they don't vote. They don't get out and vote because they're depressed and they think they have no chance. In either case, publicly announcing tracking polling and head-to-head polling has a bad effect on voting, and it's pretty clear that we need to do something to change how polling is conducted and how it's reported to the public.
All right, Bradley.
Great. So, hey, everybody, thank you for coming to this. I don't really disagree with anything Charlie just said. I think polling is antiquated. I think the methodology is flawed. I think it has negative externalities and impacts on reporters, candidates, and voters. But when I was asked which side of this argument I wanted to take, I thought about it a little bit and said, you know what? If I think about what really the problem is with American politics today, yeah, polling's a symptom of the problem, but saying polling's the problem is like saying Y2K was the greatest cybersecurity threat we ever faced. It's just not, it's not really that big of a deal. So in my mind, there are two problems. One is 99.9% of people who run for office are desperately insecure, self-loathing people who have to have external validation that comes with running for office and holding office. And it fills this hole in their psyche. And I've spent 25 years working in government and politics, and I don't know that Charlie would disagree with this analysis either. And they can't let go of that because it really is what makes them functional in many ways. And so they're never going to take a hard vote. They're never going to put public policy first. They're never going to do anything that threatens their ability to keep having a driver and reporters interested in them and their name on the wall and feeling special. That's human nature, and I'm pretty sure the politicians who, were at the Constitutional Convention or in the 1800s or most of the 20th century weren't that different. People are people. Here's the second problem, which really screws us over, which is all the things that the people at this conference love. So Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and a media that now works so fast, right? Isaac could hear something and post it within an hour. It used to be by the time it would reach voters, a couple of days. And so if you think about even in recent history, when LBJ passed the Civil Rights Act, or when Reagan and Tip O'Neill worked together to pass tax reform in the 80s, or even when Obama passed the ACA in 2009. All of those things were the result of political deal-making, negotiation, and compromise, and that's what democracy is. But today, when you have a low number of people voting in primaries, members of Congress, and this, by the way, is true at city government, state government, and it's easier to focus on the federal, are totally unwilling to do anything that could rile up the base and risk their reelection. The minute that any compromise comes up, it's tweeted about, something's posted on Instagram or Facebook, and they have to immediately retract. So if you remember the ACA, there were 2 holdout votes in the Senate, Mary Landrieu from here in Louisiana and Ben Nelson from Nebraska. And just the basic deal-making that got done were these huge scandals. They called them the Louisiana Purchase, the Cornhusker Compromise, and it barely got done. And even if the ACA repeal and reform bill that's being discussed right now were a good piece of legislation, I don't think they could pass it, certainly not through the Senate, because there's just no way these days, with the media cycle we have and the social media platforms that we have, for anyone to have any room to compromise or negotiate. So in my mind, there's only one solution to all of this, and it's this. Until people can vote on their phones, we are never going to have a true and representative democracy. We are always going to have, politicians who either govern far to the left or far to the right. And they're not crazy. They're not irrational. If average turnout in a primary is 15 to 20%, and those people tend to be either the most liberal or the most conservative based on the district, they're catering to those people. But imagine if you had a month to vote, and Facebook and Instagram and Snapchat and Twitter and iOS and Android bugged the shit out of you until you could verify that you did vote. Doesn't matter who you vote for or how you vote, just that you did vote. You'd vote. And 80%, 90% of people would end up voting. And that would do one of 2 things. It would either take the politicians we have and force them into the center and to get things done, because most people have reasonably similar views on things like immigration, guns, taxes, and it tends to be the people at each end that derail these things, but those are the people who also vote. So either it forces these politicians into the middle to get things done, or it gets rid of these politicians because they're ideologues and they're not in sync with the voters who are now participating in the election, and we get better people. But either way, if we want a government that actually functions and works, if we want to have politicians that we can hold accountable, the only way to fix that is to take average participation in most elections from 20% up to 80%. We all carry this incredible supercomputer in our pockets that does far more complicated transactions every single day than voting. Yes, there are security concerns, but there's a lot of blockchain solutions out there that I think can take care of that. Yes, only smartphone penetration is about 67%, so we would need to give the remaining 33% phones. That's really not very expensive at all. But fundamentally, that's our problem, right? People who run for office won't do anything to risk staying in office, and the current culture that we have makes it impossible for them to actually ever do anything functional until they know that far more people are voting in their primaries and they can be more reasonable as a result. So is polling a problem? Yeah, absolutely. I literally don't disagree with a single thing that Charlie said. So when Isaac takes a poll again as to whether polling is good or bad, you should all vote bad. I'm going to. But I don't really think it's the issue here. I think it's sort of a minor symptom of a much bigger problem, and we could get rid of polling, we could not get rid of polling, we could allow random digit dialing on cell phones. It would have a minor impact at the margins, but it wouldn't fundamentally change who runs, who votes, how politicians behave once they're in office, how the media covers it, how social media impacts people's decisions. As a result, we wouldn't get different results. So that's why I picked this side, and the reason I wanted to do this was just to start spreading the gospel around. As this mission comes up, and my foundation, Tusk Montgomery Philanthropies, we're working on this right now, we need all the support we can get. So, it is amazing how much more likely we are to get you guys, and this is the kind of work that we do in my day job, to support companies like Uber or FanDuel politically, because we have you in the app, and we explain the situation, and you press one button, and we know who your state rep is, your state senator, your city council member, whoever it is, and we're able to reach them. So imagine if you could do that with actual elections, the single thing that matters most. We would have a totally different country, a totally different democracy, a much better world. So I don't know if I've used all my time or not, but that's all I have to say.
I think that the question is, though, okay, so you both agree that polling is bad, and that we should maybe not pay as much attention to that. But what do you do about it? The polls are all over the place. Every day I covered last year's campaign. Just in the presidential election, we get like 5 or 6 big polls every day, and then all the little ones. How do you address that in a way that gets at the root of the problems that each of you are talking to? And Charlie, why don't you?
I'll start with on the presidential side, because I think it's easier to say that polling is accurate when we're talking about statewide elections, but on the presidential side, there is a huge swath of the country that thinks that because Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, she won the election. And if you were looking at public policy polling leading up to November, you would have just seen Hillary's ahead by a certain percentage point, and nobody really, unless you read Politico or dove into sort of insider political information, you weren't seeing that the national popular vote really is not relevant to the pathway to 270 electoral votes and how you become president. So I guess my starting point would be get rid of the national polls and focus on the actual pathway to how you become president, and that could then lead to less questioning of the results afterwards.
So, I mean, I would say this. You can't take away the right of someone to conduct a poll, nor the right of the media to report on the poll. And polls are fun. Look, you guys as the media love to cover politics and process. It's a lot easier to explain that in a 400-word or 800-word piece than complex policy. So you're never going to stop covering it. I think it's a series of short-term reforms and long-term reforms. The polls ultimately typically survey likely voters. If likely voters are 80% of the electorate, then the polls are actually pretty accurate because it's going to reflect most people. But other reforms that you could look at, term limits for members of Congress, just like you have in a lot of cities and states. Get rid of the Electoral College itself, which would really change the nature of how we elect the president. You could have greater public financing of campaigns potentially, although I do think Buckley versus Vallejo is correct. So there are a number of steps that you can take, short and long term. And there's one idea where you could go radically the other way and say, use polling to so frequently survey, and you can do this all over Facebook. You don't even really need to do it through an official pollster, but use it all to so frequently survey people in every district and publish it that it effectively becomes a real-life tally for a member of Congress as to how their broader constituents feel, not just their primary voters. And so maybe the short-term answer is embrace polling and expand it dramatically.
And I guess since you both knocked polls, maybe for the sake of argument here, since we're having a debate, let me be in defense of polls here. To an extent, we were all, I think, anybody who says that they were not surprised that Donald Trump won is either lying to you or delusional. That was a big surprise. It made everybody question what polls are. But are they really, is that a one-time thing? Are we in danger of overcorrecting on the polling question here? Bradley, you want to take that one first?
It's interesting because Charlie brought up the Tom Bradley effect, which I think obviously did apply to Trump. I read Shattered the other week, and they talked about at least someone in the Clinton campaign saying rightfully, you got up Trump's numbers by 3-4 points on any poll because of that. But, I think in 2008, people thought that the Bradley effect would apply to Obama, and it didn't at all, right? He if anything, overperformed. So I don't know. I mean, I think society's evolved enough that concern doesn't really exist. So I think, Trump was such a different kind of candidate that you made a mistake. But, if you take him out of the mix and look at most elections, Senate, governor, whatever it is, I don't think you have such distortions that you would have to worry about that.
Charlie, and we'll do closing arguments.
So, in short, I worked for a group supporting Governor Romney in 2012. And I believed that a week into the election, Governor Romney was going to win, or at least I thought there was a good chance of it, despite the fact that he was behind within the margin of error, but behind in a lot of the key states. He ended up losing if you look at about 400,000 votes in 5 states. Hillary ended up losing by 300,000 votes in 3 states, I think. But they were both very close if you look at the Electoral College and the states that mattered. The reason I thought Mitt could overcome being behind the margin of error was there's a common thought that incumbents that undecided voters break to the challenger, and we didn't believe that Barack Obama could meet his turnout model. There was such enthusiasm for him in 2008 that we never thought he could match that again in 2012. Turns out he did, and he did it, he got his voters out. That meant that I think all of us were reacting to that election in assuming that Hillary Clinton would match those Obama turnout numbers also. So when she was within, ahead but within a margin of error, we assumed that she would do the same thing Obama did and Trump would stay behind within that margin of error. Turns out she didn't match the turnout models, especially in the states that mattered for her in the Electoral College. So a lot of the analysis in 2016 was a result to the 2012, or was a result of what happened in 2012. I would, it practically suggests not overcorrecting as a result of 2016. And I would respectfully say some of the things, I agreed with about half of what Bradley said, but
I agree with everything you said.
I appreciate it.
It's not much of a debate. Let's just go into the closing arguments here. Cast the way forward here for everybody as you convince them. I guess they've both tried to convince all of you that polls are not so great.
Yeah, again, I think the answer is polls aren't really the root cause of the problem here. And we have this cognitive dissonance in society right now where people are really interested in politics. All of you have better things to do than to sit here and listen to Charlie and me, other than the fact that you're interested enough in this stuff that you're taking your time, which is valuable, and listening to us. And yet people don't actually participate in elections. And we know why that is, which is it's a huge pain in the ass to actually figure out, oh, it's Tuesday, oh, today's election day, where's my polling place, it's raining, I gotta wait online, the machine's not gonna work, all of that stuff. So the only way to solve that dissonance is to make it easier for people to vote. And if people are voting, A, in the big picture, it solves the problem of democracy because it forces everyone to a consensus in the middle. And B, it would actually, to the extent it matters, fix polling too, because if everyone now is participating in representative democracy and polling is accurately polling, if it can, likely voters, polling is going to be a lot more accurate and complete than it is today. So ultimately, I don't really care what you think about polling one way or the other. I do care that you hopefully support the notion of allowing people to vote on their phones, and given that the average age in this room is relatively young, you're the future voters, and I hope that you will advocate for this. Thanks.
Charlie?
Make it really secure and we'll talk, but if you also talked about voting early, and think about the news in 2016 that came out in the closing 2 weeks, whether it was about Donald Trump and Russia or whether it was about investigations of Hillary Clinton. All of that would have been missed by people who voted 30 days ahead, so I'm very skeptical about the notion of voting early.
Sure. All right, so we did the hands showing at the beginning. If the question is, again, do polls do more harm than good, how many people say yes? And no? All right, well, I feel like yes took a little bit of a lead.
So he disagrees with both of us?
Yeah. All right, well, thanks, everybody. Thanks, Charlie Spies and Bradley Tusk.
Thank you.